This is RN Breakfast with Fran Kelly.
Shadow Immigration Minister Scott Morrison joins me in the breakfast studio. Scott Morrison, good morning.
Good morning, Fran.
Your trip to Nauru was funded by Toll Holdings, the company that stands to benefit from your policy. Now, you say that's not unusual, but should it be unusual?
Well, it's on my register of interest, which is the transparent way of dealing with these things. And the News Limited story that was run on the same issue, that was disclosed in that report, Fran. So, I mean, the way you manage these things is through transparency and disclosure, and we've made full disclosure on these things. We're not in the middle of any tender process. We're in opposition. We're not in government. And Toll Holdings were going up there for the ordinary course of business anyway, which was in my disclosure, as was in their statement. And it's not the first time we've had privately funded trips to Nauru. We were there with Tony Abbott a year or so ago, and ABC, Fairfax and all other journalists were on that trip as well. So, look, this is a fairly standard way of doing things when you're in opposition. I mean, the government flies around on taxpayer-funded jets. The opposition doesn't have access to that, which I'm not suggesting there should be any change to that. But to get to these places, you need to make arrangements, and I've done that, and I've been fully transparent in the way I've done it.
You're not in the middle of any tender process, but
No.
we are perhaps only days away from calling an election. If the coalition wins that election, and who knows who will, in 6 weeks you could be in government and you could be in the middle of tender processes with this very company, because Toll Holdings currently has $26 million worth of contracts with the Immigration Department working with asylum seekers.
There'd be appropriate procurement processes on any of those things, Fran, as you'd expect, and those things are done at arm's length from ministers as well. So, I mean,
perception's important, though, isn't it?
Well, that's
Here
why
you are
and
taking
so
a gift from a
Fran.
company that we could expect perhaps to have contracts working with asylum seekers under a future coalition government.
And that's why I've been so transparent about it. I've been totally transparent, and it's on my register of interest. It was disclosed in the media at the time in the reports. So we've been totally upfront. Now, I could contrast that with my Labor opponents. I mean, they've made it sought to make an issue out of this. Now, this is the same Labor Party, who we had ministers who were then not ministers at that time, going off to ski lodges with Eddie Obeid and not disclosing those things on the basis they were good friends of Eddie Obeid. Now, that'll be out all about an ICAC today about Eddie Obeid. So, look, I'm quite happy to put my credentials on these things and the transparency I've displayed on these things. I've been very upfront. If the Labor Party wants to start throwing stones on this, then they're sitting in a very big glass house.
Well, they are throwing stones, but let me ask this question. Did you think about this before you decided to do it, and why didn't you just decide to pay for the trip out of coalition funds? Are you short of funds?
Well, no, but you need to make the best use of all your funds. And when you're in opposition, if there's an opportunity to get to somewhere which is important for the further policy development process, then if you're transparent and upfront about that, which I have been, then that's the appropriate way to do it, Fran. That's what the transparency and disclosure rules are for. So these things are all out there in the public. And I don't have any problems with that. And the plane was going there anyway. It wasn't chartered for the coalition. That was a misreport by Fairfax yesterday, who I just assume had a bit of sour grapes that they weren't there as well.
You have now, we know that one element of your asylum seeker policy is increasing the capacity to hold asylum seekers on Nauru. A week ago, the Liberal Deputy Leader and Shadow Foreign Minister Julie Bishop criticised Kevin Rudd's PNG announcement because it was not costed. There was no indication how long asylum seekers would be in PNG at Australian expense, and the policy was completely open-ended. Don't all those criticisms apply to your Nauru plan?
Well, not at all. First point is, this isn't an alternative to the PNG arrangement. This is in addition to the PNG arrangement.
Still, do these things hold?
No, I was just about to get to that point. But in your intro, you made the point that this was an alternative. It's not. It's in addition to what the government is doing in terms of PNG.
Except just on that point, to be clear, you've said you will keep some elements of the plan, but you haven't committed to the entire PNG plan.
Well, we don't even know what the whole plan is yet. There is no resettlement agreement currently between PNG and Australia.
So it's not necessarily in addition to,
Well, no, we will seek to implement whatever is implementable out of that agreement. But at the moment, they have no costings, they have no time frame, they have no capacity. But get to our point on that. We have said the indicative costing for putting the initial 2,000 man camp in is 50 million roughly. That's an indicative costing. That's obviously subject to going through more close, detailed operational planning at the time. In addition to that, we've got a 5-year arrangement with Nauru. That's what we'd be seeking to having in government if we were elected, and we've started and flagged that with them, and we would immediately proceed to commence those discussions if we were elected.
And what does a 5-year plan mean in terms of people who are settled there?
Well, no one anyone is resettled in Nauru, frankly, probably as it's highly unlikely many people will be resettled in PNG, given the many difficulties that are there with that agreement.
That's the agreement, though, isn't it?
Well, there is no agreement. There's an arrangement, and they haven't
They
haven't even got to the resettlement part of that yet. So, I mean, and Prime Minister O'Neill the other day on Lee Sales' program made this point. He said that people would be resettled who asked to be resettled. That's what he said in the interview the other day. Now, I'm not sure how many of those will be putting their hand up. And on the PNG arrangement, Fran, this is the test. The test is not whether people get sent there for offshore processing. They've been running offshore processing now in PNG for almost a year, and they've actually taken more people off Manus Island than they've sent there. That's not the test. I'm sure they will send 50, 100, 200, maybe 500 people there over the next few weeks. That's not saying the agreement's working. That's just offshore processing. Whether it's working or not, whether it's actually implementable, is if they have a resettlement agreement which says what the government says they can achieve, and that is everyone will not be resettled in Australia. Now, the government just can't back up that claim. It's just not real.
Well, what is your claim in terms of this 5-year process? Let's stick with the 5 years first before we get to the resettlement. Julie Bishop said the other day in relation to Kevin Rudd's PNG program, how long will Australia be paying support for people in PNG? If I ask you that question, how long would a coalition government be paying support for people housed on Manus Island?
Well, this is a 5-year rolling arrangement. So we commit to 5 years, and that's important for how we do business up in Nauru as well. At the moment, it's all very uncertain. If you have a 5-year arrangement with Nauru, then you get some greater regularity about pricing of various issues because of the uncertainty that's there currently, and that's everything from fuel to land to whatever the issues are, supplies and so on. So we have a 5-year arrangement which involves temporary accommodation, which involves permanent accommodation for processing, which is the rebuild of the centre that was burnt down, as well as the family facilities, and then the post-assessment accommodation. Now, the government hasn't even thought about that.
If you're found to be a refugee...
Where do you live? You'll be living on Nauru, and we have this 5-year arrangement, and that at the end of those 5 years, we would look at what the situation is, because there's no guarantee that people end up in Australia. They would be seeking resettlement in other countries, as was the case when the Pacific Solution worked last time.
Well, when the Pacific Solution last time, more than 40% of those people ended up back in Australia. Is that what you imagine will happen here?
Well, I'm not imagining anything. All I'm saying is the policy is that there is no guarantee, and this is the other key point. If anyone does end up in Australia, as they will under the government's plan with PNG, they will end up in Australia as well. They'll be getting permanent visas under the Labor Party. Under the Coalition, you will never get the permanent visa. You will get a temporary visa at best. And that's what takes permanent residency and citizenship off the table in what the Coalition has always said. So what we're puzzled about, Fran, is fine, go ahead and put your arrangements in place in PNG. There are many difficulties in implementing that. But why would you then stop at that? Why is that all the government's prepared to do? Why won't they do temporary protection visas? Why won't
Because
they...
the government says they're not coming back here. The government's ad, and I'm sure you've seen it in the newspaper, is if you take a boat to Australia, you will not end up living in Australia.
It's not real. They don't have an agreement to support that claim. It is a bluff. And what we see with the Labor Party's bluffs is they always unravel after the election. The same was true with East Timor. The same ended up true about Malaysia. It all unravels at the end of the day. So what we have really here is a contrast between the Labor Party's unreal solution, the bluff, or the real plans that we've announced, which encompasses the full suite of activities. Operation Sovereign Borders, as you know, it deals with everything from offshore disruption and interceptions. It deals with things right up the chain through intelligence. It goes right through to the detention space, the returns and the transfers under a centralised, coordinated command. Now, that is what actually we believe is needed to stop the boats, and people have got a choice here. More chaos under Labor with their track record, with just one shot in the locker, or to do the full suite of policies that we've been talking about and believed in for over a decade. I think the choice is fairly clear.
It's 8:15 on Breakfast. Our guest this morning is the Shadow Immigration Minister Scott Morrison, talking about the Nauru policy, which was really announced this week, an increase in the capacity in Nauru. Just to finish up on this resettling and where people go, if they're not resettled in Nauru, and they're not going to be, if some end up in Australia, basically you say the government's promising no boat arrivals will be resettled here. You say they can't promise that.
No, they can't. It's not
Under
true.
your policy, some boat arrivals will go to Nauru. They'll end up in Australia on TPVs.
What I've said is that they will need to seek resettlement somewhere else.
Yes.
And our policy is temporary protection visas as well.
For how long?
The temporary protection visas.
Forever?
Well, temporary protection visas will be at the discretion of the government. So they could be as little as 6 months, or they could be up to 3 years, and then they could be renewed as a TPV, not as a permanent visa. And the thing about TPVs...
So someone can end up going to Nauru, ending up being resettled to Australia on a TPV and end up on a TPV forever here.
Well,
is that right?
Well, we can play speculative things on scenarios, Fran. What I'm saying is...
Well, it's
just let me
important.
finish the point about temporary protection visas. At the end of someone's temporary protection visa, they would be reassessed in terms of their refugee status. So there is an opportunity to actually then send people home if hopefully their refugee situation is no longer current. Now, the problem we would have if we were in government is almost 50,000 people have turned up. 15,000 of them have been given permanent visas. There is no opportunity now for Australia to revisit those decisions. The Labor Party have given them permanent residence in Australia. Now, that is not our policy. Never has been, never would be. And that's why there's a clear contrast, because you've got to have the full suite, Fran, whether it's the last port of call, the last line is temporary protection visas. The first line is the intelligence and AFP work done right up the chain.
Sure.
Then there's the work at sea, and then there's the work in the detention space. And that's why we've said up in Nauru, as well as on PNG, you need to ramp up the capacity. Now, we have a plan for doing that on Nauru, a very comprehensive plan that we would be ready to work with Nauru. No, not just tents, as I said before. It's the permanent rebuild of facilities. It's the immediate ramp up in tented accommodation.
Which is what Kevin Rudd is promising in PNG.
In PNG, but not on Nauru. So why wouldn't you do both, Fran? Why is the Prime Minister only looking at a one-shot-in-the-locker solution in PNG? We're going to do it all.
2 quick points. The Greens leader, Christine Milne, has branded both your policies as barbaric. And she's also said in her policy release today that the humanitarian intake should be increased from 20,000 to 30,000, and that was one of the recommendations of the Houston policy. Now, you're in fact promising to reduce the humanitarian intake from 20,000 to 13,000. Why would you do that, and why don't you agree with Christine Milne's plan?
Well, I don't agree with Christine Milne's plan because that won't stop the boats, but our policy is to preserve the 13,750 places under the Refugee and Humanitarian Program solely for those who have come legally to Australia or through the offshore orderly process. Not one of those visas will be given to someone who has arrived illegally by boat. Under the government's policy of the 20,000, all of those visas can potentially be given to people who come by boat. What we have done, which those in the refugee sector have been arguing for years, is we've delinked the program.
But they also want an increase, and the Houston panel said it should be increased.
Well, we don't agree that increasing the intake at the end of the day, when you've got less than 1% of the world's refugees actually getting resettlement at the end of the day, and you've got around 80,000 places that are available globally each year, and you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people seeking them, moving that dial by 4,000 or 5,000 either way is going to make any real difference. The great risk of what the Greens have said, and I'd be interested to see what Indonesia says about this, is you don't want to create Indonesia as a magnet for people to move into either. Our policy is about regional deterrence, which stop people coming into the region, not just into Australia. And that's what Operation Sovereign Borders is designed to achieve through the coordinated plan that we have. And that's based on the lessons of years, Fran. I mean, Tony Burke's been in the job for a month. Kevin Rudd, the same, for a month. And to say that their plans have been well thought through when they've just been working them up on the run in the run up to an election, I think is ridiculous. Tony Abbott and I have been working on these plans, whether it's on Nauru, Operation Sovereign Borders, the turnbacks policy, for years. That's why we're ready to go. And our form says that we can deliver.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran.
Scott Morrison is the Shadow Immigration Minister. It's 8:20 on Breakfast.